Hey guys, today we'll talk about how to play Imperial Knights competitively in 10th edition 40k. And without further ado, let's dive right in. And first we'll discuss their strength. They are an army of high toughness, fast and deadly vehicles, which cost usually less points per wound than vehicles in other factions. For example, the cheapest one, the Armiger, the Hellmann, is 140 points for a 12 wound, toughness 10, 5+ invulnerable save against shooting vehicle. So as you can see, we have quite a good price tag here. Obviously, it is offset by the huge price of the bigger Questoris and Cerastus and Dominus Knights, but still we are gonna get a lot of bang for our buck. Next, we have good durability. We have a 5+ invulnerable save across the board against shooting, which will help you in a lot of cases. Obviously, yes, the AP is not what it was in 9th edition, for example, and there is much more cover available, so you will not always encounter situations where your invulnerable save will actually be pushed, but still it's nice to have. And also toughness 10 or 12 across the board really helps you to stat check the hell out of those opponents' guns and melee things. You also get a 6+ feel no pain as a part of your Noble Lance detachment rule, which goes to 5+ feel no pain when your army is honored. And a quick word about that, this is essentially our army rule. We can choose either the Lay Low the Tyrant Oath or Reclaim the Realm one. So the Lay Low the Tyrant one gives you, just as is, reroll 2 hit and reroll 2 wound in every phase, which is very good and very powerful. And Lay Low the Tyrant one, instead of that, if you choose it, gives you +1 to the movement characteristic of all the models and +1 to advance and charge rolls. And there's also another caveat, which is the deed. So what you need to do for your army to become honored. And as you can see, honored gives you quite a big buff. In this case, as you can see, it's 5+ feel no pain, and also some of the stratagems get better if you are honored. So for the Lay Low the Tyrant, the deed is to destroy the enemy warlord, and in some cases it's going to be very easy, in some cases it's going to be almost impossible to do. I don't think it's such a big problem because you're getting most of the benefit already anyways, and the 5+ feel no pain is just a nice bonus, which you are also making your opponent to hide or cover their warlord more in order to prevent your army from becoming all of a sudden much more durable. So I don't think that's a big disadvantage. So I've seen a lot of people be wary about that whole destroy the warlord thing, but to be honest, the deed on the Reclaim the Realm is not that easier. It's capturing the objective marker in your opponent's deployment zone. That can be quite difficult, plus you're probably opening more of your strategy to your opponent. You will actually force them to stay back as well, but they will know that you want to go after their home objective, and they can roam freely with their warlord. So it depends on what your strategy is. I would personally go for the Lay Low the Tyrant one in 90% of cases. Next, we have great output in both melee and shooting. Knights are the army that does not really struggle to destroy stuff. Yes, there are certain categories which we'll discuss that will prove a bit difficult, but in general we have good guns, good melta guns in particular on the Knights. So on the Warglaves, we have great melta on the Errant, on the Castellan as well. Not really a melta, more of a lance gun, but you get the point. Also, melta guns are free now, so you can have a free melta gun essentially on every knight that you have, which will come in handy, especially considering that you have this nifty reroll. And obviously the melee is very good. As you can see on the picture here, the knight has a giant sword, and the giant sword is not just big, it's very efficient. The big knights have 2 profiles, so one against hordes and one against the bigger stuff. So for the sword it's damage 6, for the gauntlet it's damage 8, and the gauntlet also has a sweep profile which doubles the attacks instead of tripling that with a sword, but the damage is higher, damage 3, and the sword's sweep is damage 2. So you get quite a lot of that versatility. You're not gonna be struggling too much against, say, a horde of intercessors. And even Warglaves are quite scary in combat with their damage 3 high AP, high strength attacks. If my memory serves me well, they are strength 10 now, so they're lower strength than they were in 9th edition, but still strength 10 is just enough for you to be okay into almost any target. And Plus, you can have some extra buffs to that as well from your bondsman abilities. A quick look, bondsmen are just essentially a buff that your big knights can give to your smaller one. That's only for Questoris and Cerastus knights, so the Dominus ones don't have that. They just give cover to armigers within 6 of them, the benefit of cover. But the bondsman abilities are quite nice. You can select one armiger within 12 of your knight in the command phase and give him the buff that corresponds with the ability on your Questoris or Cerastus Knights datasheet. We'll go through individual abilities later in the army composition section. The army also has quite good mobility and decent board control. All of your models are either move 10 or move 12. I'm not talking about the Dominus now because they are quite slow. Yes, they're 8-inch move, but in general it's 10 or 12 depending on which knight we're talking. The smaller ones are 12, the bigger ones are 10. You have huge bases, so you cover a lot of area and it's easier for you to reach certain areas of the board and also to just fill the objective with your stuff. You also have quite high OC, so OC 10 on the big knights and OC 8 on your smaller armigers, which OC 8, just for reference, my 185 point Nemesis Dread Knight with Grey Knights is OC 4 for 185 points, and the armiger Helverin is 140 points, so 40 points cheaper and has double of his OC. Obviously, that's because the knights don't have troops in general, if you don't count the agents, but that's just something for you to know. So you will not really struggle with fulfilling tactical objectives as well, because you do have the OC, you do have the speed, and you can pretty much flip an objective if you want to. The only problem is probably the ones that make you do an action instead of shooting and charging, but in some cases you will not have targets for this particular one Warglaive, and sacrificing his one shot or 2 shot, 3 shots of the Melta may be efficient if you want to score points. Knights can now very easily hide in ruins as well because of the changes to the towering rule, so your bigger ones can stay hidden in the ruins and are not excluded from that whole universe of terrain, and also the smaller ones obviously can do that as well, as they could always. By the way, if you want to win more games of 40k and you want me to personally look at your roster and figure out what may be wrong with it and what improvements we might make to it, check out the links in the description for my Patreon, where you can get all that help. Next, the weaknesses. Low model count is the first one. You have to be quite careful with how you position your stuff and how you use it, because if you start losing your knights, especially your armigers, there will be very big blobs of emptiness appearing on the board that your opponent will indubitably want to fill. You will not probably have something in reserve that you can throw there on that objective or that part of the board to cover that hole, because you are an extremely elite army, even more elite than, say, Adeptus Custodes. Be careful with your resources, because it will be hard to score enough victory points during the game if you lose a bunch of stuff in the early parts of the game. You also don't have a lot of volume of shooting, so going against hordes can provide a challenge for you. In those situations, you're probably better off just shooting and killing the stuff that can actually hurt you. Hopefully that's something that you can reach out and touch relatively easily with your guns, and then just planting yourself, your huge base on the objective, and hoping that your OC will at least match or be higher than the stuff that the opponent can put in there as well. So unfortunately, you don't have the volume of shooting to go through all those models, so you will have to adapt. Your models are vehicles, and with that come a lot of limitation in terms of how you use terrain. You cannot go through walls, which will make it harder for you to go against the armies that are infantry heavy, that will essentially always have an advantage against you. It's also hard for you to screen efficiently because you cannot go through walls, they can, and also you, as I said already, have a low model count. And also your models are vehicles, so anyone who has some specific abilities against vehicles, like anti-vehicle 4+ or something like that, will also have a benefit against you, but that applies to almost any type of unit or type of a model in the game. You also don't have an invulnerable save in combat, which that one, it really bugs me, because for once they did not give 2+ save to the Questoris Knights, which I think should have been long on the Questoris Knights. They should have always been 2+ save. They gave 2+ save to Dominus Knights, but that doesn't really change the situation. I think they already had it in 9th edition, if I not mistaken. So this makes an easy target out of your knights in combat against high AP attacks. Obviously, a lot of attacks are AP1, AP2, so you will not really feel the difference, but for those, I don't know, C10 attacks with AP4, this will be a problem for your knights. And worse than that, you don't even have a choice of an upgrade relic like you did have in 9th edition, where you could have at least one knight with a 5+ or potentially 4+ with a strat, knight with an invulnerable save in combat. And there's still this stupid one command point rotate Iron Shield stacks that makes you spend the CP to just have a 4+ invulnerable save. That is annoying, and people will be baiting that out of you. It will be horrible. I'm sorry, but that's just how it is. I always hated the stratagems. I always wanted them to remove it from the game completely, but alas. And last one isn't really that big of a disadvantage of the faction itself. It's just the fact that we have to use the good Imperial agents models, the allies that we have access to, because knights don't work as well, especially scoring tactical objectives, without the agents. And we'll talk which things I recommend to take a bit later. Now, the army composition. In general, you want to aim for a 2-3 big knight build, and the rest of the army, apart from the agents, should be the armigers. In terms of the warglaive Hellbrand composition, you probably want a 2-to-1 or 1-to-1 ratio. So if you're running 6 armigers in general, 4 of them should be warglaives and 2 of them should be Hellbrands, unless you are planning to build something like a Crusader plus 3 Hellbrands mix or something like that. The versatility of the warglaives is just so good that it's worth to pay those extra 10 points to have them in your list as much as possible. If you want to play full small knight army, you should probably look at Chaos Knights, because they do it better than the Imperial Knights, and the Imperial Knights still have the Bondsman abilities even though they were nerfed. We've already discussed what they do. There are a lot of good choices in the Knights Codex index of the models. Almost pretty much any knight is playable. A standout model for me in particular is the Canis Rex, which we'll discuss in detail for his incredible efficiency into most targets. And he also doesn't suffer the Bondsman nerf that I'll explain now, because he doesn't have Bondsman ability. The Bondsman nerf that is active at the time of recording this video, which is February 2024, is that the Bondsman ability does not apply to the big knight itself when he applies that Bondsman ability to a warglaive or Hellbrand. When the index was initially released, we could apply the Bondsman ability both to the big knight and the small one, which made those abilities significantly stronger. For example, the Warden's ability, Bondsman ability, which is -1 damage, could apply to the big knight himself, and big knight with -1 damage is scary. They might reverse that in the future, hopefully, especially if knights don't show great results in tournaments. So, in terms of knights, let's go through all of them, well, most of them, and discuss which I think are good. First, Cerastus. I really like the Atropos because of his special abilities against vehicles and especially against Titanic models. He's very good, and his profiles are very all-round, so he can do well into almost anything, and he also is quite good in terms of the price. The Castigator isn't bad, but unfortunately he misses his Bondsman ability a lot, because he really wanted to have those sustained hits on his a lot of shots gun, and he doesn't have that. The Lancer is what Gallant wants to be, so he is taller, he's faster, he has more wounds, he has a 4+ invulnerable save in combat, so in general he is the best melee knight we have access to, but he has a big problem that he doesn't, like everyone else, benefit from his Bondsman ability, which was incredible, which was advance and charge. So yes, he will do well helping an armiger, a warglaive get into combat, but unfortunately he cannot advance and charge himself anymore. Still worth it in my opinion as a good YOLO knight. For the Questores, I really like the Aaron because he's just that cheap. You're paying 405 points for him and you're getting a full knight with a big nasty gun. His Bondsman ability isn't bad. It gives the armiger assault for his guns, and he can also reroll the advance rolls. Aaron's own rule is +1 to hit when he's targeting the closest thing, which works for ranged attacks only, but is a very good rule to allow him to get the best out of those thermal cannon and melta gun shots he has. And maybe potentially even the carapace weapon, which out of them I probably do recommend the Icarus autocannons in most cases, because that's just a very good profile, and also against some fly targets with high toughness like Monolith, for example, it's so funny to be wounding on 2s. but the Storm Spear rocket pod isn't bad either. I don't like the guns currently in this version that we have in the index, because he doesn't have the 5+ invulnerable save against combat, and this model doesn't work for me if he doesn't have that, or at least something else in addition to the -1 to hit and melee that he has that would protect him in combat. Yes, he costs only 400 points, if you can say that, but I just don't see the reason why you would take him at the moment over, for example, the Errant. Paladin is quite good. His Bondsman is giving lance and lethal hits to a Warglaive, or a Hellmann if you like, and that's a very good set of rules, allowing that particular model to punch through and get that damage across. His own rule is also quite good. It allows you to once per phase reroll hit roll, wound roll, or saving throw for this model. So in the shooting phase of your opponent, you can reroll save. In the fight phase of your opponent, you can reroll save. In your fight phase, you can, for example, reroll a hit roll or wound roll, and so on. Very good set of rules. Also, the price on the Paladin is quite good. I think it's 425 points. And also, the main gun is not bad, but has one severe problem, which is AP1 on it. Everything else about this gun is just magnificent. It's 72-inch range. It's blast, D6 plus 3 shots, which are rapid fire D6 plus 3. So you will be getting 2d6 plus 6 shots in absolutely most cases, because 72-inch range. And it's damage 3, so good against anything. Strength 10 is great against most things. And still AP1, which it ruins everything, because almost any unit in your opponent's army will have cover, and anything that has cover and a decent save is going to be just shrugging off those damage 3 shots. It's just the problem that those types of guns have. It's the same issue that the Nemesis Dreadnought had on the Nemesis Psy Cannon, which now has been solved with extra AP and also ignoring cover, which makes that a really good gun. Hopefully Paladin will receive the same treatment once the Codex releases. Next is the Warden. I really like this one because he has probably the best Bondsman ability, which is -1 damage, and when he could apply that to himself, that was just awesome. And his gun is also nice. It's very versatile, strength 6 AP 2 damage, to the same profile as it always was on the Avenger Gatling cannon, but more shots now because the whole toughness scale has changed, so they needed to adjust it. He also has devastating wounds against anything that is not monster vehicle, so against hordes, well, not really hordes, something that has 2 wounds or even 3 wounds, something that has an invulnerable save, it will be quite good. Crusader is a gun platform knight. I don't really like him because he really misses the times when the Titanic feat were 12 attacks, and now he essentially is defenseless in combat, unlike all the other knights apart from Hellmann as well. And that is not really cool. I understand why they did that, but I don't really like the Crusader in its current form because of that. His Bondsman ability isn't bad. It's good for Hellman's, it's +1 to hit for ranged attacks specifically. So if you use the Mythic Hero enhancement that gives you an ability to choose 2 armigers instead of 1 for your Bondsman, you can make a really cool shooting platform in your backfield. The Crusader also gets sustained hits 1 if he stays stationary in the movement phase, which I hate rules like that. They're very cool if you think about it cinematically, like a knight digs his feet into the ground and prepares for a punishing salvo, as the name of the rule suggests. But unfortunately, in the game as it is, it doesn't really work that way. And all it will do is just your opponent will know that your knight has to use this ability to get the sustained hits, and they will cover their assets, and it means that you will have to lose that ability in order to get line of sight into some things. Anything that is incentivizing you to stay stationary is usually a bad rule. And I cannot recommend a knight that doesn't do anything in combat as well, unless it's a Hellmann, which is very cheap. As for the Dominus Knights, they both give cover, as I said, to armigers within 6 of them, and they both have quite scary profiles. The Harpoon on the Valley and the big lance on the Castellan. My problem with those is that both don't fight well in combat, both have 8-inch moves, so they're not as fast as I would want such a huge model with a huge base to be. Obviously cost more than the Questoris Knights. And I'm not sure that the amount of damage you can do with a Castellan to something like a monster vehicle will be enough to justify his cost. It will probably be okay, and if you really want to do to try out something like a shooting knight, you're probably better off with a Castellan than you are with the Crusader. but still I would probably go for the Custodes ones with more armors instead. For example, it's a 500 something points model and has a plasma decimator, which is d6 plus 3 shots, strength 9, AP 3, damage 3. And if you know my Space Marine videos, you probably know I'm a fan of Redemptors, and this looks awfully like a Redemptor gun, but the Redemptor gun has AP 4 on it and d6 plus 1 shots instead of d6 plus 3, but again, that's a 500 point model. Obviously, that's not the only gun, it's one of 2 bigger ones, but I'm not sure you'll get enough gun for what you've paid in points. That's my point. Now let's quickly discuss the allies. So you really want the Calidus in every list of Imperial Knights you make. There's just no argument for not taking her. Any list you make just starts at 1910, and then you go down from there. You might also want to have an Eversor, for example, because he is a cheaper agent. He also does quite well into the chaff units that, as we discussed already, you might not want to expend your resources on those, and he's very fast. Zippy, he can be in help you be in a lot of places at once. Alone up, obviously, so having something like an Eversor and Calidus combo is a nice idea. Also, in terms of cheap unit that you can leave on your home objective, you can go for something like the Acolytes or whatever the name is, like a 40 or 50 point unit, whichever one you like Henchman, for example. I wouldn't go for more than 1 or 2 because you are at that point wasting the points that you could have spent on more Warglaves, more Helverines. And the math on building a knight army is such that you don't really have a lot of those spare points. Unless you want to sacrifice an enhancement or something, you'll usually be in a situation where it's either a whole nother Warglaive or you're buying 2 squads of cheap stuff, cheap infantry or something like that. Building a knight's list is always an art form in and of itself. Especially if you're like me and you're a perfectionist and you want those 2,000 points on the nose, that is almost impossible, and I have not been able to do that in this particular video, as you'll see at the end with the roster example. So yes, use the fact that we have the best allies in the whole game. The Imperium has the best allies, much better than the Chaos ones, and definitely bring some with you. Next are the special characters. In this case, we only have one, which is Canis Rex. As I promised, we'll discuss him in detail. It's a Custodes Knight without a bondsman ability, as I said, but a couple of extra tricks for himself. First of all, he hits on 2s both in melee and shooting, which greatly improves his damage potential, especially considering that you will have that reroll to hit and wound from a Lay Low the Tyrant if you choose it. He also gets a free stratagem every battle round, so like a captain's ability almost. The problem here is that, unfortunately, they've nerfed the Knight's stratagems, so almost all of them are not battle tactic. The only one you can use it on in terms of the Knight's specific stratagems is Shoulder the Burden for 2 command points, which is a good one, don't get me wrong. In your command phase, you can select this Knight in particular, or any other Imperial Knight, and until the start of your next command phase, improve your model's move, toughness, save, leadership, and objective control by 1, and also add 1 to the hit roll. You can only use this once or 2 times if your army is honored, and that's a very good stratagem to use if your Canis Rex gets injured, because you can only use that on a knight that lost any amount of wounds. Not a bad 2 command point stratagem, but it just feels a bit restricted because of the changes they've made, and just in general lack of battle tactic strats, or you can use it simply on a command point reroll. So not a bad start already. Hits on 2s both in melee and shooting, and has a pre-stratagem. In addition to that, he also has a pilot inside, as any knight does, but his pilot can actually disembark. He's smart like that, and if the knight is destroyed, the Sir Hector can remove himself from the knight and walk away unscathed. He also has Lone Up, so long-range shooting will not pick him up, and that's very good because if your opponent has, say, a secondary card that says that they need to kill a vehicle and they've poured all of their efforts into killing Canis Rex, they've ultimately done that, and then Sir Hector disembarks and ruins their day, because until you kill him, the knight is not considered to be destroyed. It's an incredibly good ability. His damage is also magnified by his ability that makes all 5s count as critical hits, and that combines very well with his Sustain 1, as if they're blended. Sustain 1, guns, and melee, so all of the profiles he has have Sustain 1 rule. So not only you'll be scoring extra hits you'll be also doing that more often in 33% of cases. And that, coupled with his incredibly good las impulsor, which is either d6 blast shots at strength 14 AP3 damage 4 or 2d6 shots at strength 7 AP1 damage 2, which is not that impressive, and his gauntlet, which is 5 attacks instead of normal 4 and does 9 damage on the big profile. So you will be doing some nasty damage to almost anything in the game. And all that goodness is gonna cost you 435 points, so roughly like any other Questoris Knight. Now the synergies. So 35 points enhancement Mysterious Gardening is very good. It allows your knight to have Deep Strike, and also once per game you can redeploy him like, say, Grey Knights or Hypercrypt Necrons. So you do it at the end of your opponent's turn if your knight is not engaged. You can also combine that with Rapid Ingress, so you can first hide your knight in Deep Strike if you don't have enough space, if you've looked at the board and understand that you will not be able to hide from a lot of shooting of your opponent because there's just not enough room in the ruins, and you can then decide to put one knight in Deep Strike, which it can be a nice move. You can also then use Rapid Ingress on him, obviously, and when he arrives, you can also redeploy him if you need that. And even though knights are quite fast with 10-inch move, that's not still enough to cross the entire board, so sometimes it will be very useful. People are just not really used to knights flying around the board. Next enhancement costs 30 points. In this case, it's Banner of Macarius Triumphant. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And that simply gives your knight sticky objective rule. That's very nice for any army that is low on models. So, like, I really like this stratagem for Adeptus Custodes, and I really like this enhancement here for the knights. I wish there was something like an ability on one of these knights to have that, but that would be probably too good. It's obviously very helpful for your low model count and just to keep your agents or other models that you have free from standing on the objective for the entire game. For example, in the cases where your opponent doesn't have any redeploys, so your objective is not threatened by anything. Next one is the most inexpensive one, which is the Unyielding Paragon, 40 points. So it's gonna be the cost of the cheapest allied infantry squad. So be careful taking this one if you don't have enough chaff. Though the buff is very nice, it reduces the AP characteristic of any attack that targets the knight by 1. So it essentially gives him the 2+ save against anything that is not AP0. It would be so cool on a Knight Valiant, but unfortunately those cannot take enhancements, but I wish, because he has 2+ save, so it would be so cool to have 1+ save and potentially cover Knights just walking, stomping across the board with his harpoon. That would be awesome, but GW doesn't want us to have all the fun. Still a good enhancement, I think. You have also good stratagems, such as the Valiant Last Stand for 2 command points, so you can fight on death. Usual rules apply, and you also count as having only 1 wound remaining, or all wounds remaining, if your army is honored. In any case, fighting with your big knight, whether it is hitting on 3s or hitting on 4s or hitting on 3s if you're fighting with cannon strikes, it's a very good stratagem to have in your back pocket. Another strat I really love is the Squire's Duty for 1 command point, just 1 command point. You can select up to however many armigers you have, because there is no limitation. It says 2 or more armiger models here, so I assume you can select as many as you want. And at the start of the shooting phase or start of the fight phase, so it's universal, you increase the strength of armor penetration characteristics of their weapons against a particular enemy unit in your opponent's army by 1. And if the army is honored, it also increases the damage characteristic, and that's all for 1 command point. So this one is a battle tactic, so you will see Calidus's and similar abilities targeting that very often in games against you. But if it doesn't cost 2 command points, I recommend to push that button every phase, whether you're shooting or whether you're fighting, because it is worth it in most cases. Lastly, let's look at my roster example. So here I have 1985 points of Imperial Knights, and something is breaking in my soul right now, because I had to choose the enhancement that I chose, because I think it's a better choice. I have chosen on the Knight Warden Mythic Hero enhancement, which allows me to choose 2 Warglaives and give them -1 damage, and I think it's just better than giving him the Unyielding Paragon, even though that would make it 2000 points on the nose. Apart from the aforementioned Warden, I have Canny Strikes here, obviously, Knight Errant with a Meltagun. The Warden also has a Meltagun. I have 2 Helverines, I have 2 Warglaives, and the Calidus Assassin. That all comes down to 1985. Obviously, you can play around with this list a lot. You can, for example, remove one big knight and have 2 more Helverins and also something like an ally as well. You can play with the enhancements, but in general, your list will probably look a lot like this one. So let me know if you agree with me on how to play Imperial Knights, how to build their list, how they operate. I really like this army, and I really think that you can play it very well and be a very scary opponent to face, but they require a lot of finesse because obviously you have very few models, so any mistake that you make is gonna count. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.